It's my great pleasure to inaugurate our 2013 speakers with the annual Sackler Lecturer, who is Scott Fishman. I could spend an hour describing everything that Scott has done, but I'll compress it very much. In fact, looking at the audience reminds me that several years ago, I coined a term called the algocracy, which is a combination of algo for pain and aristocracy. So I'm looking at the room, and we certainly have the Boston contingent of the algocracy present, and I think it's only fitting to use kind of vaguely royal terms because Scott has an unrivaled history of success and contribution to pain policy, pain education, and it's the latter that he's going to focus on now. We also are very fortunate, and it's actually a sign of her dedication and nurturing of the projects that she does support, to have Christina Spellman from the Mayday Fund here come up from New York and hear what Scott has to say. As I mentioned, Scott is one of the most outstanding of my former fellows, of whom there are several, like Zahid, and I see a few others in the room, Zahid Bajwa, and therefore it gives me great pleasure to have Scott come and talk. Scott is actually back east because he's just been participating in a 2-day summit at the Institute of Medicine on the issues relating to the aging of America. So I could talk forever, but just Scott has been a past president of American Academy of Pain Medicine, has been involved in American Pain Society, has led numerous initiatives, and the initiative to which he kindly invited me to participate a year or so ago involves a collaboration with two principal investigators, Scott, who heads, as you can tell, the Division of Pain Medicine at UC Davis, and the Dean of the School of Nursing, Heather Young, in what has turned out to be an exemplary and high-impact effort defining interprofessional competencies in pain. The area of interprofessional education is a hot one, and we're going to be hearing more and more about it. I'm sure that our Dean, Dr. Berman, sees this word a lot. I must say that our program actually was interprofessional from day one, except no one was using that word then. So I feel like the person in the Molière play who was finally told that he has been speaking in prose, except he never realized that all his life. I'm going to stop now and let Scott take the podium, and I'm going to welcome you with a round of applause, because I know you've got a lot on your plate, you're traveling east, but we're really, really grateful that you made time to come speak here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear okay? It's really a...
Wait, I forgot to add, there will be a panel afterwards, that's why I'm also truncating, of various interprofessional members of the algocracy who may want to comment on whatever you have to say.
So you don't have to just listen to me, and I'm really honored to be here. As I'm sure everybody here knows, Dan Carr has earned the reputation of being the great stem cell in the field of pain medicine, and he's touched leaders internationally as this young field has now developed into hopefully some maturity. My task today, as Dan asked of me, is to talk about interprofessional education, an area that I want to just disclose to you is not an area of any expertise of mine, but an area of interest, and as Dan said, an area that I think we're going to be hearing more about. But what's striking to me is how many of us have been doing this for years prior to this buzz term and all of this attention now. And one of the great interprofessional programs in pain in the nation is the Tufts PrEP program, which I think all of us in the field of pain medicine across the country are very, very proud of. I want to just, before I start, go through my disclosures. I have no direct financial relationships with industry, no compensation from speakers programs or consultation programs. I participate in official CME. I'm, as you heard, the past president of the American Academy of Pain Medicine, the past chair of the American Pain Foundation, and the current chair of the Pain Care Coalition, which is a consortium of the American Society of Anesthesiology, the American Pain Society, and the Academy of Pain Medicine. I thought I would start with a story. And some of you who have heard, or had to hear me speak before may have heard this story. It's about a physician who dies and goes to hell. Has anyone heard that story before? In that case, it's a true story. And the story is of a physician who winds up in hell and is very upset about it. And the devil sees this and says, you know, all the physicians are upset. I don't understand why. Physicians seem to not like to be told what to do. So I often give the physicians a choice. And the physician was given the choice to spend eternity in room A or room B. Room A was an ICU with patients stacked to the ceiling with beepers, blinkers, body fluids, and not a nurse to be found. The physician ran out of there and went into room B, which was a room of patient charts. It was an eternity of medical records. Now, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed room C, which was occupied by 4 or 5 well-groomed looking physicians who were followed by 3 or 4 happy looking nurses who were bringing them coffee and rubbing their shoulders and attending to their whims. And he runs to the devil and he says, I've made up my mind, I want to spend eternity in room C. And the devil chuckles and says, I'm sorry, that's nurse's hell. You know, I tell you that story to give you a sense of the differences in professions and how we look at each other. They're quite striking, and these differences have probably played some role in some of the public health crises that we find ourselves in America. When I tell doctors I'm a pain specialist, I often receive their condolences. And you know, a lot of practitioners can't imagine taking care of patients in pain all the time. And when you look at the burden of pain in America, you recognize that this is an enormous problem. Undertreated pain is said by the World Health Organization to be the #1 health problem in the United States. More people with chronic pain than diabetes, heart disease, and cancer combined. And a recent Institute of Medicine a review of the subject, actually a congressionally mandated review that was directed through healthcare reform by the Affordable Care Act, estimated that approximately 100 million Americans are in chronic pain to the annual direct and indirect cost of about $600 billion a year. So this is a major problem. And it's not just chronic pain. Tufts was one of the sites that debuted a movie that was funded by the Mayday Fund. And again, I'm also grateful for Christina Spellman, who's here today, who helped fund this film and helped fund our efforts to develop core competencies in pain that I will go over at the end of my talk. This film talks about the lack of resources globally for individuals dying and at the end of life in pain. And the reason I mention is that it stands, I think, in stark contrast to the problems that we have in the United States, where we have an abundance of opioid use. In fact, I think most of us would agree we have excessive opioid use. We consume, I think, 80% of the world's opioids. We consume 99% of the world's hydrocodone. Maybe we're just using so much of it, it's not available at the end of life in other countries. But I'm not sure that's the case. And many of us have argued that really the problem is education. Pain is the most common reason a patient goes to a clinician, and yet we don't talk about it much as we educate our healthcare professionals. And we have a major problem in medicine that is really parallel or reflected by the problems in pain, which is a healthcare system that's fragmented, expensive, impersonal, or we could say patient-centric, reductionist, illness-oriented, etc. Same problems that are reflected in the way that we practice pain care in America. And many of us have argued that it comes down to education, but it's also a system that I think, supports the status of pain as really an orphan within healthcare, within the House of Medicine, within other organized clinical systems, within organized health research, and particularly within organized education. Pain doesn't have a home. It's a subspecialty without really a parent, I think, if you think about it. And Dan and I have worked together over the years looking at ideas around whether pain should be its own primary specialty. I must say that I've come full circle on that, because the prevalence of pain is so pervasive that if you made it its own specialty, it might actually just be more siloed and insular and less available. This is a debate that's going on right now within medicine, probably more within medicine than other areas. So the question I wanted to ask of you today, and maybe it's something we can talk about later, is how did we get here? How did we get to a system where we have really what appears to be conflicting public health crises of undertreated pain and excessive use of opioids and prescription drug abuse? The two would seem to be conflicting. My hypothesis is that it really is a perfect storm, and it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that healthcare is very, very complex, and we've brought really simple, reductionist, and very fragmented solutions to bear on the problem. And it's really, the problem of pain is too pervasive to be siloed. And again, we all typically go back to what we're educating or what information we're giving our students in all of these professions. I think we're seeing now a paradigm shift to how are we preparing our students to interface with people who are suffering as teens. So it's probably still important that we bring this information, but the information alone may not do the job. Going back and looking at where we've come from educationally, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Flexner Report of 1910. This report set the stage for making scientific knowledge, evidence-based education part of the curriculum, if not the core part of curriculum in medicine. It was an important advance that many would attribute to major changes in longevity or quantity of life in the United States. Others would say it had no bearing on quality of life, a distinction that I think is quite important when we look at how we're changing. We've gone from now a major sea change to embracing science in our education to something that happened around the middle of the last century, where we started to think about not just what we know, but how we think about these ideas, and problem-based learning programs like McMaster in Hamilton and Michigan State in East Lansing pushed the way, and then Harvard, the new pathway, which is no longer new, looking at how we think about the knowledge we have. And now to really, I think, a new plateau, which is what do we do with that knowledge once we learn how to think about it? And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about this in the future, because it will hold us to a higher standard, not just of having knowledge and being able to solve the problem, but having to show that we have the competency and skill to impact the care for our patients, truly a patient-centered process. I want to share with you some of the things that I've been learning about over the last several weeks, and one is this commission on education of health professionals for the 21st century. This was a commission that was funded by the Bill Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and reported on their findings in 2010. And I'm going to refer to them quite a bit through this talk. They came forward with 8 specific systemic problems in healthcare. The top 2 were mismatch of competencies to patient and population needs and poor teamwork, which I think is something that we should all consider. And this idea of teamwork isn't trivial. And when you look at it, it's not so much about how well we can do when we work in teams, but I think what gets our attention is how poorly we do when we don't work in teams. This says, how can they work together if they don't learn together? These are some of the comments from the Commission. Professional education has not kept pace with these challenges, largely because of fragmented, outdated, and static curricula that produce ill-equipped graduates. Laudable efforts to address these deficiencies have mostly floundered, partly because of the so-called tribalism of the professions, i.e. the tendency of the various professions to act in isolation or even in competition with each other. This is from the World Health Organization, which has held now several summits on this subject. Interprofessional healthcare teams understand how to optimize the skills of their members and share case management and provide better health services to patients and the community. The resulting strengthened health system leads to improved health outcomes. And they went as far as to say that the state of education is insufficient to support effective collaboration. Reform is necessary, and the necessary reform is the introduction and support of interprofessional education. So I thought this was quite dramatic. One of their quotes is, new ways of relating to patients and each other. The healthcare workforce needs effective teams and significant redesign. This is, again, one of my favorite quotes from their writing. How care is delivered is as important as what care is delivered. And I think this is going to be the paradigm shift that we see going forward. What are the barriers? Why aren't we doing this now? It's interesting. This is really, mom and apple pie. We should, can't we just get along? Shouldn't we work together, etc. So why aren't we doing this? There are surprisingly few models of collaborative care, of interprofessional education, interprofessional care models within major organizations. This is a quote that Dan and I just heard at the Institute of Medicine, so I grabbed it. I thought it applied, that I'm all for progress, it's change I object to. So why do we avoid interprofessional activities? And I think the reason is pretty simple. They're hard, they're more complex, they're more resource intensive. I think there are all sorts of natural reasons why we avoid them, but there are also some other reasons that have to do with identity and what's called cultural frame. Each profession has its culture. These cultures really dictate to us who we are, what we stand for, what we offer to our young, what we put forth in terms of the services we provide, and that culturation process starts very, very early and persists very, very long. And it's comparable to something that you've probably all heard of called ethnocentrism, which was advanced by William Graham Sumner in 1906 in his book Folkways. It's the tendency to view the world from the perspective of our own culture, and this is what Sumner wrote. Each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts its superior, exalts its own divinities, and looks with contempt upon outsiders. And with ethnocentricity comes strong group affiliation, which often leads to negative attitudes towards outsiders and stereotypes. And I suspect this is going on in medicine and is at least partly a cause in the reason why we keep up barriers and we are less than excited about sharing the load, even though no one profession and certainly no one clinician can carry the load themselves. So how does the course change? Well, going back to the Lancet Commission, they suggested we adopt competency-driven approaches to instructional design and promote interprofessional and transprofessional education that breaks down professional silos while enhancing collaborative and non-hierarchical relationships in effective teams. So if you went back 30 years ago, that was really the beginning of the conceptualization of interprofessional education. It was a nascent field with rare enthusiasts around the world. And if you look today, there are programs in most major health systems that are starting and building. There was the recent announcement of a national collective coordinating center for interprofessional education, which is housed at the University of Minnesota. This is a center that was funded in part by the Health Resources and Services Administration, as well as by major gifts from foundations, including the Hartford Foundation, Macy, Gordon and Betty Moore, who funded our School of Nursing, and the Hartford Foundation. What is interprofessional education? Well, there are two major definitions. They're very, very similar. This is from the Center for Advancement of Interprofessional Education, and they are probably the oldest, most accepted definition. This is a group from England that started in the mid-'80s, and their definition is when two or more professions learn with, from, and about each other to improve collaboration and the quality of care. And it applies to learners before and after they qualify as practitioners. That's a particularly English way of saying it. Their pre-qualification and post-qualification state would be equivalent to pre-graduate, postgraduate, undergraduate, etc. The World Health Organization took it upon themselves to redefine this in 2010. The definition is not, I think, substantially different. And their definition is when students from two or more professions learn about, from, and with each other to enable effective collaboration to improve health outcomes. It's associated with a lot of other terms, and I won't bore you with them. So why interprofessional education? And I've told you a little bit about, really leading up to this, but there's a real belief that if we educate ourselves in a culture where we work together and collaboratively, that we will in fact work together collaboratively. Many feel that there's strong evidence for this. I'm not sure the evidentiary basis is all that strong, but it certainly makes common sense, particularly when you look at the problem of medical errors. And I mentioned before, the evidence might be more glaring about what happens when we don't work together than when we do. More people die of medical errors in the United States than motor vehicle accidents, unintended overdose deaths from opioids, or gunshot wounds. So it's a tremendous source of morbidity and mortality, and it's directly associated with our inability to communicate and collaborate. In fact, the Joint Commission in 2004 identified that infant mortality and morbidity and mortality was related to communication errors in 72% of cases. I thought that was just quite striking. In terms of the evidence base, it's not strong. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details about the data. There have been two very good reviews of the data. The first would be the Cochrane review, which found 6 studies that met its criteria for methodologically. 4 of these were positive, 2 of them weren't, and they ultimately concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to draw clear conclusions, but it looked promising. Scott Reeves, who one of the leaders in the field, who was at University of Toronto at the time, is now leading the program, the inner cross schools of health program in Interprofessional Education at UCSF, the University of California, San Francisco, did a review looking at the systemic reviews that had been done, which included over 200 studies. And again, I think the power here was a problem, but he drew some interesting conclusions, he and his group, that interprofessional education is delivered in a variety of clinical settings from acute to chronic, acute primary care and community care, and in a variety of health conditions from acute to chronic. The nature of the programs involved varied combinations of professionals, but most commonly it was a combination of physicians and nurses, usually voluntary. Rarely was there ever accreditation, and there was a major variability in how long these programs lasted, whether they were continuous or not, et cetera. Most were 1 to 5 days. They were most commonly delivered to postgraduate learners in their workforces, but increasingly are being offered to pre-graduate, pre-licensure learners. And the methods varied, but most commonly were seminar-based discussions, group problem solving, and role play activities. Most studies were methodologically challenged. And again, I won't bore you with all the details other than there were a lot of different problems. It was interesting that most of the data was positive based on the learner's perception, and very rarely on objective measures of behavioral change, which again is a harder standard. Undergraduate programs typically, or pre-licensure programs typically, were based on the learner's subjective perception, and postgraduate programs were also largely based on the learner's perception, but also were more likely to involve organizational changes, which were objective and were positive. In terms of the literature support for the types of education that are being used for this competency-based interprofessional experiences, they were exchange-based learning, such as seminar-type discussions, observation-based learning, such as joint visits with patients and clients, action-based learning, such as problem-based learning, simulation-based learning, simulating clinical practice, practice-based learning, such as interprofessional clinical placements, and electronic learning or distance learning, such as online discussions. So where are we now with this? This I thought was quite a dramatic statement by the World Health Organization, that they believe, they've stated that following 50 years of inquiry, there is significant evidence showing effective interprofessional education enables effective collaborative practice. I'm not sure what they exactly base that on, but I think it's impressive that they think that. Interprofessional education is a necessary step in preparing a collaborative, practice-ready health force that's better prepared to respond to local health needs, and they mean this globally. So in terms of interprofessional education for pain, with my hypothesis that the problems in pain really are quite a microcosm for the larger problems we have in healthcare, I think interprofessional education actually makes a great deal of sense, and maybe is that added ingredient that we've been looking for to partner with this need for education, which hasn't seemed to take us over the finish line in terms of improving pain care. The pain care that we deliver is very much like the global health care that's delivered. It's fragmented, it's expensive, it's not always patient-centric, it's sometimes impersonal. And I would say that is true across the spectrum from acute to chronic to end-of-life care. And this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to change the way we educate our clinicians across professions, who are all responsible for treating and mitigating suffering and pain, and are all part of that process. But it raises the bar for us significantly. And if we think about how we're going to approach this new kind of education, I think we all need to think about where we start. And again, a paradigm shift in education is that you don't start at the curriculum, you start at the competencies that are an expected outcome of our teaching and our curriculum. So that stimulates me to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the work that we've done at UC Davis with the help of a magnificent interprofessional consensus group supported by the Mayday Fund. This is work, as Dan said, that was led by myself and Heather Young, who is a wonderful partner. She is our Vice Chancellor and Dean of our Betty Irene Moore School of Nursing, which is a new school funded by a $100 million gift from that foundation about 5 years ago now. The purpose was to develop these core competencies because for years we had been looking at this problem of undertreated pain, hearing about the lack of education, and wondering how are we going to mitigate this, trying to look at the education and the curricula out there in multiple schools and really having no handle on what to use to judge that education. And we recognized that what was missing wasn't the curriculum, what was the core competencies that had never been articulated for pain. And these are core competencies that we ultimately conceived as necessary for any school of health professions, across professions. So what we did, and I'm going to go through this quickly for you, I'm happy to speak in more gruesome detail about it. It was a project that took about a year to get to this point, maybe a year and a half. Phase one was an information gathering stage where we gathered an executive committee. I'll tell you who that was. Advisory committees, literature reviews, really scoured the field to make sure that we were fully informed and we weren't filling a gap that had already been filled. Phase two was consensus building, which involved a major summit, a summit attended by this interprofessional consensus panel of experts, of which we were very fortunate to have Dan Carr as part of. So I'll just flash through this. This is our executive committee. Our executive committee was made up of individuals with expertise in education science and consensus building, in developing core competencies in the past, in medical education and educational initiatives for pre-licensure learning, and in curriculum development across professions. We held this 2-day summit. 30 professionals were part of it, all from different areas of healthcare. And basically we all went into this dark hole of trying to look at what is it that would be core competencies that would be expected of any learner in a pre-licensure health professional school. This was our bigger committee. I'm just going to show you these names. I wanted to highlight this name. Some of you may know Ian Kovner. He's a recent graduate of the prep program, and he's now on my faculty. I'm quite pleased to say, and he was a major part of this study as well. So in terms of the activities of this summit, we came together. We had a preliminary draft of competencies that were drawn together by the executive committee for the group to look at, to discuss. We went into a World Cafe model of reviewing these, revising them. There was initially very little consensus, and miraculously at the end, we came to consensus, and we've ultimately spent the time since that summit revising these core competencies. we came up with core values. And the reason we came up with these core values is that these were concepts that continually permeated all of the core competencies and ultimately were redundant. So instead of being redundant in each core competency, we set these as core values and principles. I'm going to just name them: the advocacy, collaboration, communication, compassion, comprehensive care, cultural inclusiveness, empathy, ethical treatment, evidence-based practice, health disparities reduction, interprofessional teamwork, and patient-centered care. And in making these, we actually came up with a initial overarching structure, which were kind of simple questions that we thought should be answered by, or answerable at the end of each, at the end of the program for each pre-licensure student. But we realized that the International Association for the Study of Pain was concurrently working on curriculum for professions and an interprofessional curriculum. And we wanted to make sure that whatever structure we created could be easily used by that, I think, very seminal process. So we made domains that docked very easily with the domains of the IASP. And these are the domains under which our core competencies fall. These are really the initial questions that we asked, which is: what is pain? How is pain recognized? How is pain relieved? And how does context influence pain management? And within those, they fit very neatly with the 4 domains that all of the different uniprofessional and the interprofessional curricula have used, which is the multidimensional nature of pain, pain assessment and measurement, management of pain, and clinical conditions. So I'm going to really conclude this by showing you our core competencies, and I'd be very interested in any of your feedback, with the caveat that this was made by committee. We are going to be publishing these competencies, but our hope is that these competencies will be the beginning of a process of thought and revision. And to our knowledge, they've never existed before. The first is what is pain, the multidimensional nature of pain, and the competencies are to explain the complex, multidimensional, individual-specific nature of pain, present theories and science for understanding pain, define terminology for describing pain and associated conditions, describe the impact of pain on society, and explain how cultural, institutional, societal, and regulatory influences affect assessment and management of pain. Now that's a lot. And I just want to stress that our goal is to have schools use these as guidance and to emphasize them appropriately within their professions. And each profession would emphasize these differently and use them differently, frankly. And even within professions, different schools will interpret these differently, use them differently, and emphasize them variably. Domain 2, how is pain recognized? Use valid and reliable tools for measuring pain and associated symptoms to assess and reassess related outcomes as appropriate for the clinical context and population. Describe patient, provider, and system factors that can facilitate or interfere with effective pain assessment and management. Assess patient preferences and values to determine pain-related goals and priorities, and demonstrate empathic and compassionate communication during pain assessment. The third, how is pain relieved? Demonstrate the inclusion of patient and others as appropriate in the education and shared decision-making process for pain care. Identify pain treatment options that can be accessed in a comprehensive pain management plan. Explain how health promotion and self-management strategies are important to the management of pain. Develop a pain treatment plan based on benefits and risks of available treatments. Monitor effects of pain management approaches to adjust the plan of care as needed. Differentiate physical dependence, substance use disorder, misuse, tolerance, addiction, and non-adherence. Develop a treatment plan that takes into account the difference between acute pain, acute on chronic pain, chronic persistent pain, and pain at the end of life. And the last is How does the context influence pain management? Describe the unique pain assessment and management needs of special populations. Explain how to assess and manage pain across settings and transitions of care. Describe the role, scope of practice, and contribution of the different professions within a pain management care plan. Implement an individualized pain management plan that integrates the perspectives of patients, their social support systems, and healthcare providers in the context of available resources. And describe the role of the clinician as an advocate in assisting patients to meet treatment goals. It's a lot. So our goal is we're publishing this now. We're going to promote this and hopefully get uptake. Again, as I said, this isn't the final verdict. This is going to be revised and considered, and hopefully we're going to see change in curricula and maybe even embracement by accrediting bodies who will expect that our graduates have these competencies at the time that they graduate from our professional health schools. So that's the conclusion of my comments. I very much look forward to hearing from you about what you think of these and where you think this is all going. As I said, I think the problems of pain in America reflect larger problems of healthcare in America. I think we're all in agreement that education has to change. Just none of us want to really suffer with the change and make those first steps. This is from Cool Hand Luke. What we've got here is a failure to communicate. This is from the World Health Organization. It's no longer enough for health workers to be professional. In the current global climate, health workers also need to be interprofessional. Interprofessional education is an innovative strategy that will play an important role in mitigating the global health workforce crisis. I'm coming back to my hypothesis that I think this has been the path of least resistance. It's the harder thing to do. We probably won't do it until we reach a tipping point where we have to do it, but many of us are pretty convinced we're coming to that tipping point very, very quickly. So finally, I think this is an opportunity and one that we shouldn't resist, but we should embrace. Improving pain care does start with education, but that education is going to have a lot to do with how we work together and changing the culture of care as much as the information related to that care. And this is my last quote. In the long history of humankind, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much, Scotta. In case anybody was wondering whether they had heard a lecture that embodies the cutting edge of thinking about interprofessional education as it interacts with pain, this was such a lecture, and Scott was especially gracious to trim what I know were over a couple of hundred slides into a very short talk, because we realized that we have experts in interprofessional practice of pain assessment and treatment with us, and I go back to what I was saying, that it's like the person who realized he was speaking in prose. So I'm going to call up a panel. I'm going to structure the discussion, and forgive me if I'm missing a name or two. As you know, we're at a meeting, we're doing this on the fly. We have some terrific people. In no special order, I'm just looking around. Pat Tablowski is a former Associate Dean at Boston College School of Nursing, a specialist in gerontologic nursing. Suzanne Hanser is the Director of the Program on Music Therapy at Berklee College of Music. Ewan McNichol, one of the early graduates of our program and an editor of the Cochrane Collaborative Review Group on Pain, Palliative, and Supportive Care, pharmacy background. Ronald Coolidge, psychology background. Amy Hull from New England School of Acupuncture, one of our strong long-term collaborators. And that same Ian Kevner not only graduated our program, but he was one of these wonderful people who get dual masters in acupuncture. And now, Mary Beth, okay, don't panic, okay, because I know we had, with this being the cold season, there were a couple of people who we wanted to have who had colds. If I have forgotten someone's name, please forgive me, but I think this was the panel, about 5 or 6 people, so come on up. We were just improvising, and As everyone's getting up here, we thought we could spend maybe a half hour or so with people's reflections, because every one of these people has practiced interprofessionally. I just wanted to observe that looking at this makes me realize that the natural order of things used to be thought in thermodynamics, the second law, that everything would kind of wind down to some homogeneous soup. And for those of you who followed the Nobel Prizes in physics, Ilya Prigogine won the Nobel Prize in physics for providing the first coherent explanation as to why the opposite seems to happen. How it is on the planet Earth, it began as sort of a rock in space and then became more and more differentiated. So things don't wind down. The second law of thermodynamics is not actually the description of the real world in all places. Complexity increases inexorably. So with that thought, and we're all settled, and I haven't forgotten anybody, let me call on Suzanne. What do you make of all this?
Oh, well, thank you. Shall I?
Go for it.
This over? As a music therapist, I feel a stepchild of the interprofessional alliances that have been forged by my wonderful colleagues, such as Dr. Carr. Music therapy is dependent upon other professions. We're dependent upon physician referrals for the work. We're dependent upon a multidisciplinary team. And yet we feel we can make some very important contributions to pain assessment, pain management, and the many competencies that Dr. Fishman recommended. I was really struck with the core values that you mentioned, Dr. Fishman, because I think that this is really at the heart of things. If we keep those core values very present in the work, then we know why we're here, and we're going to call upon whatever expert, whatever professional, whatever discipline is necessary to meet the patient's needs. And so I really appreciate that perspective of competency and values together. And I also feel that there's considerable optimism, not only because of the incredible prep program here at Tufts, but because integrative medicine is coming to the forefront. And so professionals, not only in fields of medicine, but in fields of complementary and alternative medicine, are coming together, realizing that each has a role to play in meeting the complex needs of people in pain and of patients in general.
Well, this is really exciting to me. My name is Pat Tobolowsky from Boston College, and thank you, Dr. Fishman, for your excellent comments. I think this is definitely about time, and as an educator and as a gerontological nurse practitioner, I applaud this effort. So for a long time, nurses, physicians have been educated in different schools, learning different languages, and then we're graduated and we go forward and we're supposed to work together and we're supposed to know what each other does and recognize competencies and skills. And of course, that's sometimes problematic. So I am very lucky because in gerontology and geriatrics, we've known since the 70s that the best care is delivered by teams. And the VA did some great work back in the 70s and 80s to get us going. And I have been able to be part of an interprofessional team and care for frail elderly nursing home residents for over 20 years now. We've been working together. So I know that it is possible. I know it can be done. Is it simple? No, it's not simple. And one thing that always happens right in the beginning is we are dealing with different schedules. So the medical school has 3 semesters a year, the School of Nursing has 4, the medical school starts on September 8th, the nursing school starts on the 12th. We already have overloaded curricula both in medical school and nursing, so when we add stuff, what do we take away? And I can tell you as educators, we never take anything away. We just keep adding and adding and adding, and now we have the added burden of technology, so we give students online assignments, interactive case studies, watch these videos, Students sometimes come out of our classroom, they have to read 600 pages a week. So it's a huge burden, and I think that we have to become more efficient at looking at what is nice to know and what is need to know, and really, making that distinction. We also do, I think, protect our turf to some degree, and we sometimes develop interprofessional education, which is really not IPE, it's more like parallel play. So you have a doctor come in and give a medical lecture, and then you have nutrition do a nutrition lecture, and then you have physical therapy talk about mobility, but the teachers have not come together and developed their own objectives and their own curricula. So I look forward very much to the promulgation of your competencies. And my only initial thought, because I haven't had a chance to really digest them, is in your domain 1, you talk about the impact of pain on society. I would also add the individual, because in gerontology, the only thing that really matters is function. So if you control someone's pain, but they're not able to eat better, participate in social activities, gerontology now has had a major paradigm shift, which is not only adding life to years, but not only adding years to life, but adding life to years. So if people can't function better, if people can't enjoy their lives, if their pain treatment is so burdensome to them that they're so sedated, or they're constipated, or they're dizzy, or they're nauseated, then of course we haven't really done anything for them. We've only compounded the situation and made things worse. So I applaud these efforts, and I'm excited. I look forward to it. We do know that we're getting away from looking at credit hours and number of clinical hours in advanced education nursing to looking at competencies. So I'm really thinking these competencies are going to help us and help us to structure our curriculum, and I look forward to the future.
Now, if I can just comment as you're moving the mics, I think that Competency 1 does express that. I'm going to have to take a look, because if you didn't see that clearly, we haven't articulated it properly. So thank you for that. And the one point that I would want to make is that I don't think that anyone's arguing that all education needs to be interprofessional, and there's many who feel that very brief interventions, interprofessional interventions, will make profound change in the culture of care. So it doesn't have to be, huge. But others have also opined that it's not going to happen until we're really forced to do it, and this idea that we're transitioning from motivation from shame and humiliation to shame and accreditation. Thank you.
Yeah, the CCNE, which accredits School of Nursing, is looking very closely at IPE competencies, and they are hopefully going to be integrating them into their accreditation standards. But now again with technology, we have the opportunity for interactive case studies, doing clinical rotations, and Mary Naylor's work out of the University of Pennsylvania, where she looks at transitions and handoffs, and this is where so many errors happen because we really can't communicate, we can't share. So if we could pick some crucial areas where teams could learn to function, like pain, like end-of-life care, I think that would be nothing but fabulous. And it's not going to be easy. We have these challenges ahead of us.
Well, one of the reasons it's not easy is exactly what you said, that interprofessional education is not the collection of uniprofessional education in the same room.
Exactly.
So it's a higher bar.
I very much agree with what you just said, and I was interested in Dr. Fishman's talk that he mentioned that the domains that you come up with were based on or in collaboration with the IASP core curriculum, and as you know, these were an advancement of core curriculum recommendations that were made back in, I think, 2005. And as you also know, a lot of these recommendations haven't been taken on by schools of pharmacy, nursing, medicine, or whatever. And I'm interested in your perspective on what has changed in the last 10 years that will allow schools to take this on, or what still needs to change, and if what needs to change, how will that be driven?
Yeah.
As you mentioned, schools don't want to take on any more than they already have.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think it's partially, supply and demand, or force, shame, accreditation. But on the other hand, I think it's very hard for well-intentioned schools to look at curriculum change until they have competencies. Because really what has, I think, changed in the last paradigm shift over the last maybe 30, 50 years is this idea that you don't build the curriculum first, which is the way we've always done it, but you build the outcome of the curriculum, and then you target the curriculum to give you the outcome you desire. So I really do believe that that's the change that will drive the train.
I also agree that this is an idea whose time has so come. It's a real welcome change, and I agree about as educators, we don't want to be adding and adding to our curricula, and I wonder if you've have you thought about, discussed how ways to integrate these competencies into existing curricula? I mean, has that been part and parcel of the conversation?
So we actually, in parallel with doing this, consulted various curricula chairs and deans of education to talk about this, and the overwhelming advice we got was keep it short. And this is probably what you saw is probably 20% of what we were working with up front.
Right.
It's probably not short enough, but hopefully it will get boiled down further in its next iteration. Implementation, I can't tell you all that much about. We haven't implemented it. We've looked at programs to do it. We've kind of imagined how we would do it in our medical school, our nursing, our pharmacy, nurse practitioner PA programs. And we are envisioning doing it through simulation models. We're a leader in health technologies, and we have a real state-of-the-art health technology center where we can pretty much either make or conduct any kind of simulation. We have a center for virtual care, and that's our model. But I just think there are so many different ways to do it, from on-site to distance. The list is almost endless, and we specifically wanted to remain agnostic to that, so that these are simply going to be the endpoints, but the path is going to be up to the school.
We've had a couple of opportunities at the New England School of Acupuncture. Well, obviously, and so I'm delighted to see you and pass the school's regards on to Ian. Obviously the PrEP program, with the NISA, the New England School of Acupuncture, and PrEP having a joint program, that's huge. I'm going to harken back to what you said about, I'm paraphrasing, that integrative care is not, side-by-side care, but integrative care as the way it stands now is often side-by-side care. We've had a couple of opportunities to have our interns, our acupuncture interns, in some of our satellite clinics, where we are in different hospitals and public health settings, for our interns to work a little bit side by side with practitioners in other disciplines. For example, at the Cambridge Health Alliance, there are Tufts family medicine residents there, and our interns are there, and our interns will give an acupuncture treatment to, so we're not doing patient care with them, but our interns will give them an acupuncture treatment if they want it. And I was there at the clinic observing, doing some evaluation assessment there one day, and this resident came in, he had an acupuncture treatment, and he said, if anyone's ever had an acupuncture treatment, you're familiar with the deep level of relaxation that you have when you get off the table. And he said, I never would have considered referring to an acupuncturist ever. Like, I sort of didn't even want to go near you guys. But now, especially, he spoke with the intern, he said, now I'm very interested in learning more, in collaborating with an acupuncturist, that sort of thing. And with Lou Hayes, one of the prep faculty, who's the medical director at a hospice, we have a postgraduate clinical training, specialty clinical training at that hospice, and so our acupuncturist will go on visits, home visits with other professionals, with the nurses, the social workers.
Fantastic.
So it's a nice opportunity to do that. And I love what you said about cultural identity, however you phrased that, and how that feeds into egocentrism. And I think it's wonderful for allopathic and CAM providers and educators to really look at that, because we're all in our own silos there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with everybody here, but I'm going to be a bit of a curmudgeon.
Ron, that's shocking.
I think we have a lot to live down here in terms of the effort to do cross-discipline education as well as interdisciplinary treatment. Everybody, or a lot of people here, remember the days of interdisciplinary pain programs in the 80s and 90s. They're all out of business now for the most part. In fact, a very famous one, I could mention it because they're no longer in business, was the Spaulding inpatient program. And Joe Gerstein, who was the medical director when we did look at managed care some years ago at APS, he said, in reference to Spaulding, he said they never saw a discipline that they didn't like. Okay. So the argument is there are cases where I think Scott, you mentioned the data on some of the education, and the data isn't quite there yet. So we need to look at what settings this works in terms of cross-discipline education, and what settings it might not work in. And we need to look at models for delivery and kind of use some of the mistakes we made in the past with quote-unquote interdisciplinary care. So we don't just throw all these disciplines in a pot and assume we're going to necessarily get a good soup here. So,
Can I comment on that? That's an interesting perspective. You know, I look at it as the days not of interdisciplinary, but multidisciplinary. And there's a big difference there, where we believe that, going back to the days of Benica and the Spaulding pain rehab program, that we could champion any disease by bringing more specialists to bear on the case. And that obviously was a financially unstable, unsubstantiable solution. And most of us then moved into this idea of interdisciplinary work, where within each of us we would need to have more than just our discipline. And I think that that's a model that I think it goes without, is hard to argue. I'm trained as an internist, a psychiatrist. I did anesthesia fellowship with Dan at Mass General. I have boards in hospice and palliative care. I do surgical interventional pain work. I'm an executive vice chair of an anesthesia department. And I don't feel trained broadly enough to deal with what we're seeing every day in a pain clinic. And yet, that's the job. It's the same problem that every family doctor and primary care doctor faces on the front line every day. But it's one that we have to accept. This is different. We're really talking about how are we going to work as professions that all have a role in care. It's not about bringing more professions to bear. It's that none of us can do it alone. And I think that's a very, very different place that we find ourselves in now. And if you look at the way pain management is practiced, I think it says more about the practitioner than the patient. I think we've got to change it and make it so that it's about the patient. And when you look at what the patient needs, they need the collective help of the professions that they need. It's not all of them at once. It's whichever ones they need. But when they do, those professions have to be able to sync and work together for the best care of the patient. I think I'm done.
Well, I thank you very much. I just wanted to make a point or two and then open to the floor. We were seeking to have PT and OT represented. It just was purely, there were some schedule issues, but we value our PT and OT students. They're valued colleagues. And many of you know at Tufts, Tufts has just enrolled its first class in the new physician assistant program. Huge part of medical care, tremendously important. Rich Murphy, who heads that, he's got his plate very full, and we thought we would spare him, but probably if we do this program a few years from now, we can get his appraisal of how things have come. I want to point out we have an exceptionally hands-on dean and clinical dean. I'm seeing Harris Berman and Henry Klappholz here. It's just phenomenal that they've taken time out of their busy schedule. So let's open it up for a few minutes to the floor. Maybe we'll see how long the questions are. I have about 5 minutes in mind, and I'll start with Mary Beth Singer.
I just had a comment, I think, earlier. It really is about breaking down silos and improving communication. Somebody mentioned handoffs from different services. I think really if you ask me what the major core competency is, it's communication across specialties and across institutions. And the only way we're going to get that is to invest in the technology to make electronic medical records safe, protected, and transparent, so we can all care for patients. Barriers that are there for us are insurmountable, which is very difficult. And I think many of us pride ourselves in doing our best to try and connect with primary care. I'm an oncology MP, so we try to make sure we keep the communication lines open. But the reality of practices, there aren't enough hours in the day sometimes to do it right. And so picking up the phone was to be what we did, and we do less of that. Sometimes the phone call works, but everybody's busy. Email seems to be my preferred method, and if you can do it in under 20 characters, sometimes that's best.
Well, your comments were echoed by the Lancet Commission as well, and they highlighted very much the same points.
A couple of other, by the way, I also want to acknowledge our wonderful students here. I see Ali Karim, who's a dual NISA prep student, Carol Saravkhan, dual OT and prep certificate, Diane Felchi, who changed her career as a result of being in prep to focus on the unmet need of nursing assistants and become a consultant in that area. I'm probably missing a few others. Wendy, our past associate director, I'm just trying to see who I can spot at first glance. So anyway, Rena Block from Rehab, another important part of the picture.
Yeah, so I was listening to your remarks and coming at it from having been in rehab medicine now for over 20 years. I got a little bit more in the curmudgeon mode, I suppose. To me, it just feels like it's reinventing the wheel. It's sort of a discovery by perhaps anesthesia, perhaps by other groups, that there are, things work better if you have people from different disciplines talking to one another and coming up with treatment plans together. And again, that's the model that we use for inpatient use, for outpatients. The problem, the reality is that none of this is compensated time. There are too many financial pressures on people. And to be able to sit, even for example, in one space, in one room, and talk about patients, unless you have some way in relieving the financial pressures on those individual practitioners, is not going to happen. And listen to people from some of the complementary and alternative medicine, acupuncture, music therapy. Well, none of these are compensated or paid for by insurance plans. It's not by what my patients have. So, yes, it's wonderful. I can't send anyone to them. So, people would be welcome to come and discuss patients with me, but it's not something viable. So that's the list of barriers, the financial barriers, which is part of the time barriers that Eric has been talking about.
Well, I hear you, and I think what you've articulated is right on, but I think what you've articulated is the problem, not opposition to the solution. I think what you've articulated is that you're stressed practicing in isolation. and I think we're going to find that we just can't continue to do things the way that we are.
Well, I think that's what I perhaps did not articulate clearly enough is that the model, having worked now long enough, 20 years ago, we didn't have some of these same pressures. We had wonderful models that were working, and those models, in a sense, I hear you, it's just a question of resurrecting those models and figuring out how are things going to work financially now. Perhaps as one gets more into capitated systems, that becomes more viable.
So I think that I think what I'm hearing amongst many comments that you made is that this isn't going to change until there's some driver, and there are many resistances here. But the thing that can change before practice changes is education and changing that culture of how we work together. I don't hear anything in what you have argued that would be a resistance to training together and cross-fertilizing ourselves together so that we work in ways that, you may be right. Maybe we already have the capacity and we don't do it because of other drivers, but many feel strongly that we don't do it for other reasons, and they're largely because of culture and identity. And that's easy to change.
Scott, can I just say something? I think we're going to also need to measure the impact of that working together, which is going to be the key thing to move this forward.
So we're now seeing funding where we haven't before, and really major efforts. This is starting to leave infancy and become at least an adolescent.
By the way, as I shifted space, I see Emily Rowe, pharmacist background, another student. Sorry, my line of vision was impaired. Mary Beth, did you want to add something? You had your hand up, and then Johanna, also from rehab. Okay. At least it wasn't to denounce the concept, so, okay. Joe?
I guess to echo what Dr. Block said, that in rehab medicine, this team approach we've been doing for a long time. So that's why I sat through this kind of scratching my head a little bit, that this is not a new concept to us in our field. But I think just the culture in medicine where grief has become an issue. Sorry, we're all guilty of that. We all want to make as much as we can, but there's also the cultural change is the resistance to, well, if I would suggest something to somebody, they're going to take it as if I don't think they don't know what they're doing. So maybe this educational thing where you have to accept a little bit more the opinion and wanting to help, not that you're targeting the provider, that they don't know what they're doing. In approaching this kind of interdisciplinary approach, where it's supposed to work together to help the patient.
I think part of the problem as well is how do you actually measure the impact of a multidisciplinary, the Cochrane review mentioned 6 different studies, none of which were the same, all with different outcomes. It's very difficult to show a financial gain. It's difficult to show a difference in functionality, pain reduction, etc., etc. So how do we prove our case?
Well, that's the golden ring, I think, showing that, and no one has, and there's growing commitment to trying to do that.
Another question?
Yeah, I didn't know whether chaplaincy was included among the people who participated, but one of the things that I'm thinking about is the meaning of suffering, and that a person's capacity to endure is certainly very much at the heart of the experience of their pain. If it has meaning, that's a whole lot easier than if it seems meaningless.
Yes.
And then the other question is about, and I was a few minutes late, so if you're addressed this, I apologize. The ideal composition of the pain management team. And then if there is, then not every teams aren't going to necessarily be that ideal, but then to be able to say, because we're missing this discipline, here are the competencies we don't have available to us that we might want to pull in. So that the entire menu is being identified. As an oncology social worker, I do guided imagery, I'll use CDs for music therapy. I do hypnosis. I'm appreciative of the degree to which that's being embraced here, but I'm certainly not seeing it as universally recognized as valid pain management.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say we did not have chaplaincy as part of the group.
I'm gratified that you're embarrassed.
Yeah. It's a major part of what we do. I think it's, it's an area that is, widely recognized as a critical part of the pain management team in palliative care or end-of-life care. I always like to say that everything we do in pain management is palliative care, except we don't discriminate against people who are dying. And I think that the reverse would be the case, where those team members should have a role. So again, I'm doubly embarrassed. In terms of what you do, you described how you extend yourself clinically to meet the needs of your client or your patient. And that's the job for all of us. So again, the competencies specifically, the process specifically tried to remain agnostic to how they would be used, and not to determine who should be part of the team, but that these competencies at different levels of emphasis should be meetable by almost any professional, health professional graduating from health training. With that said, I don't think it would be appropriate to look at them and say, how would that inform us of who should be on the team? Who should be on the team is going to be determined by the needs of a patient. And end of life care, there's a general framework, but you stay flexible in terms of who needs what, et cetera. So that's really the best answer I think I can give you in terms of the standard pain team, because it impacts what I said, and then also resources. So for me, I may be the team, but what I know, it's not, again, I would say it's not, again, about piling on different professions to show, for a show of force. It's about my knowledge being informed by the knowledge, the culture, the perspective of other professions, which I can tell you has been invaluable to me. And when I come to see a patient, I bring that all myself. That's the change that I think most are looking for with interprofessional education, not bringing 20 different professions in the room with one patient.
Now we have a question by Joe, one other question, and then Mary Beth, your hand's come up. So we'll probably go about another 3 or 4 minutes and then call it an evening. Joe?
Yeah, so I'm a veteran of small inpatient outpatient systems, and there was a value to it, but there was a real weakness in that it never connected well with the rest of healthcare. That was part of the problem. So those programs got patients who nobody could help, and so that doomed it to failure financially. So part of this educational need is that to recognize earlier on, before a patient gets to that state where almost nobody can help them, that they need a more interdisciplinary approach. And I'm struck now working at Harvard Vanguard, where we have a pain team that's interdisciplinary, that's multidisciplinary, that we're still faced with the problem of communicating. Even though we have sophisticated electronic medical records, we have a system, Harvard Vanguard, that's devoted to collaboration, yet it is still impossible to effectively communicate with the primary care team. And I think part of this is pain being the hot potato that no one really wants to take over. It's hard to be in a position, you can see this in a lot of people around Boston, where they don't want to do anything with these complex pain patients because they're afraid they're going to own these patients. And it's the same thing with the primary care. And so it's like they're just being passed around from specialists to specialists now. There's one pain unit that will take them and hold for a while, they're happy to see them. When instead it's this collaborative model. It doesn't require teams that are all physically at the same site. It just requires the ability to communicate and to collaborate. So I think it's so essential, and we're still fighting these remnants of an old educational system where it's like you're torturing someone to give them a suggestion, like you say. When we have, it's like we're not trying to step on your plate, but yes, we're all in this together. Let's figure out how we can get this particular patient to succeed and not sabotage them. I mean, how many times have we done one thing, they go back to the primary care, and they go, you're getting a totally different message. So I think this is, it is so critical. It doesn't mean we're reinventing the wheel, as some people are suggesting. It's something more fundamental.
Now, what I'm going to do, I think those are valuable comments, and there's a few more. We're just going to have like a 10-second comment, no time for question, because we brought a lot of people here. People have stayed. They're great, but they have busy schedules. So we'll do 3. 1, 2, and 3. When? So your question there or comment?
Oh, I just got a comment. So although it appears that we're reinventing the wheel, I feel like the empathy of pain is become more of a hot topic, and it's an area that we're actually, having residents go into, as a specialty. And so I think that in that regard, it does take some further evaluation, look into it and say, what exactly is pain? The organ of pain is so different. It could be somatic pain, it could be emotional pain. So I think it does require that we have more of a multidisciplinary approach.
Thank you. Mary Beth, your comment?
I was just going to say really there's no better quality indicator than pain. We've got to look at universal outcomes to look at regardless of the practice setting. Look at how effectively you are managing pain. And I think it tells you all you need to know about the quality of communication and teamwork.
Thank you. Wendy?
I hope I'm testing my theory correctly. What I'm hearing you say is that what you're hoping for is that when people graduate from whatever program they come to, they not only have developed competency as that profession, but they have developed a competency around pain and a common language that each provider can say, yup, that's exactly what we're going for. So it's driving the competency from the professional stance to actually the entity that we're all working for. So we can extend that to diabetes or whatever as time goes on. But this is a great beginning.
And I couldn't say it better myself. And I think, pain is that paradigm that is part of all of those other diseases because, people are suffering and we're mitigating that suffering.
Well, I wanted to thank everyone for coming here, up from the deans downwards, and also a special shout out to Pam Ressler, who was here earlier, another student become faculty who's now off teaching in our program, and I'm sure Pam will cover this in her blog. So thanks to the panelists, and thanks especially to Dr. Fishman for traveling here in the middle of a very busy schedule.